Hello. You're listening to the Bitcoin Advocate podcast. I'm your host, Andy, and if you're new here, welcome. This is a show where we discuss all things Bitcoin on a weekly basis. This is a show that I wish I had when I first got into Bitcoin, which is why I started this podcast. This is your one-stop shop of complex topics in the wonderful world of Bitcoin, explained in simple ways. As a reminder, this show is available on YouTube, Spotify, Amazon Music, and a whole bunch of other platforms. So wherever you might be listening from, if you like the show, be sure to follow and subscribe. You can also follow me on Twitter at twitter.com/thebtcadvocate. Also, today's episode is sponsored by myself. More specifically, I have a book about Bitcoin called Hyper-Bitcoinization, a story about a revolution. And if you're watching this on YouTube, there is a link down below in the description for it. Otherwise, you can search for the title on Amazon and it should be the first result. It's not selling out if it's my own product. Anyways, without further ado, let's jump in. Last week, we talked about the 6 properties of money with relation to Bitcoin. We explored how Bitcoin masters 5 out of the 6 properties of money, namely durability, portability, divisibility, homogeneity, and scarcity. And the property that it has not yet completely mastered is acceptability. Although recently, major advances have been made in this category with the adoption of Bitcoin as legal tender in El Salvador and the Central African Republic. This week, we'll circle back to talking about gold. So far in this show, I've talked a lot about the history of money and the importance and pivotal role that gold has played as money in our history. There's a reason why when we describe something as the gold standard of a category, we mean that that specific product is superior or of extremely high quality. When it comes to money, we relied on a system where gold was the foundation of what we would call money, and paper money used to be just claims on gold that was sitting in a vault somewhere. With the gold standard of money, we had a system that was in accordance with the axiom of money, which once again, recall, states that in order for a form of money to be of value, tangible work or effort must be expended in order to create more of that money, otherwise that money becomes worthless. So it seems like we had a good system going, but eventually we all abandoned the gold standard and moved to a fiat standard. As far as I know, there are no countries in the world that still rely on a gold standard. Since we've spent several episodes talking about the drawbacks of our fiat monetary system, is it worth it or even possible for us to go back to a gold standard? Well, to explain this question, the story begins in Renaissance Italy in the late 1300s and throughout the 1400s. The Italian city-states of Genoa, Venice, and Florence are considered the birthplaces of what we would now recognize as modern banking. Since gold is heavy and hard to transport, if you had a lot of it, you cannot take it with you when you traveled. Recall when we discussed gold's lack of portability in detail in episode 3, when we discussed the 6 properties of money for the first time. Due to this inability to be transported, keeping it in the house was also a great risk to you, since you would be making yourself a target for robberies. This would then require you to either take up arms against would-be assailants or hire your own private security force. Further, if you were a merchant in, say, Venice who wanted to do business with someone in Florence, carrying the gold to the other city would be difficult and a risky endeavor all by itself. Again, you would make yourself a target for robbers. The Italians solved these issues by building a bank. The idea was that you'd put all your gold in the bank and the bankers would issue you, in return, paper claims to the gold. They would be the one to take full responsibility of safeguarding your gold. By delegating this task to professionals whose full-time job it is to guard the gold, you not only reduce your risk of getting robbed, but you can also travel with the paper claims instead of the gold. If you had business to do in another city, you can just bring your paper claims to a branch of the same bank in that other city and exchange your paper claims for gold again. This made traveling with a large sum of money a lot easier and gave a huge boost to the overall economic activity in that area. In fact, exchanging the paper claims back to gold is often unnecessary, as merchants discovered that you can just pay people with the paper claims themselves. And the person who receives the paper claims can also just exchange the paper for value with another person directly, so long as everyone trusted the bank that issued the claim, and in the back of their heads, they believed that they could redeem that claim for gold at any moment. Gold's lack of portability caused people to naturally prefer having this convenience over actually using gold as money. Indeed, this is convenience. However, there's a subtle difference between using this system and what we had before. Under this paper claim system, we've delegated the ownership of our assets to a centralized authority. This isn't a problem if we trust that that centralized authority will always act in the best interests of their depositors, but we, as the depositors, can we always trust them? At some point, some clever banker realized that most people prefer the convenience of dealing with paper claims of gold instead of redeeming the actual gold, meaning that they could issue more paper claims and there were gold in the vault to back it up. So at some point, a full reserve system became a fractional reserve system, where only a fraction of the paper claims were backed by gold, and the bank is just relying on the fact, or sometimes hope, that not everyone would redeem their paper claims all at once. But since most of the time, a fractional reserve system seems to work unless there is some huge crisis, most of the time people just went about their daily business savoring the convenience of using paper claims, or were just simply unaware or didn't care what was going on. Over time, we traded our control of money in favor for convenience, and we became one step removed from the real money, which is the gold that sits in the vault rather than the paper claims of gold. You see, despite gold faring well across 4 out of the 6 properties of money, just a seemingly small shortcoming, like its inability to be moved quickly across space-time, and to an extent, its poor divisibility, which makes it unsuitable for small purchases, led to a centralized fractional reserve banking system. Since I know most of the audience is from Western countries, I will speak to this issue further from an American perspective. Since the United States is currently the world's largest economic power, and what the US does has a disproportionately large impact on the world, especially from an economic standpoint, to explore how we ended up with our fiat system further, we'll have to go back to the United States in 1934, even before Bretton Woods. In 1934, then U.S. President Franklin Delano Roosevelt signed the Gold Reserve Act of 1934. The Gold Reserve Act made it illegal for American people to hold gold, with the exception of jewelry and certain collector's coins. A year prior, Roosevelt had already signed Executive Order 6102, forbidding the hoarding of gold coins, gold bullion, and gold certificates within the continental United States. Some people, like famous investor and founder of Bridgewater Associates, Ray Dalio, claims that not only has the U.S. already defaulted on its debts several times, the first time was indeed Executive Order 6102 in 1933. The reason why Executive Order 6102 and the subsequent Gold Reserve Act of 1934 were passed were, of course, to shore up the gold reserves over at the U.S. Federal Reserve. Simply put, the U.S. government needed more gold, and since the dollar was still backed by gold at that point, the U.S. had realized it had issued far more dollars than they had the gold to back up their dollars. In Ray Dalio's own words on this matter, by breaking the link to gold, this allowed the U.S. to continue to spend more money than it earned, simply by printing more paper dollars. Now, eventually this law was repealed and Americans were allowed to own gold again, but by then the dollar's linkage to gold was so weak it was practically broken. And recall what we discussed in episode 2. The US dollar's link to gold was fully broken in 1971. So to summarize, in a span of within 500 years or so, we went from owning the gold, which is the real form of money, to trusting a centralized power with safeguarding the gold and using paper claims that were backed one-to-one, to using paper claims that were no longer backed one-to-one, to not being able to even own the gold itself, to now being able to own the gold again, but our money's no longer linked to the gold, and now we have a fractional reserve banking system, but for fiat currency. We're so far removed from the actual money that is gold that we have a form of money, fiat money, that is not backed by gold and also not held in full reserve at the bank. So, yeah, that's how we ended up with our fiat system. And to circle back to the original question, if the gold standard was so good, can we go back to it? I think we can safely agree that the answer is no. You see how every step of this process from gold to fiat made sense at the time. So let's say it's the year 1400 and I want to do business with another person in another city and I don't want to travel with a bunch of gold bars. I want to buy something small and not have to shave off a flake of gold to pay. So yeah, of course, if the centralized system exists, I'm going to use a centralized service to help me. Now, gold wasn't even fast enough for 1400s Italy, so it's definitely not going to be fast enough for our modern day life. The issue with the gold standard is that it inevitably leads to centralization, meaning that if I can snap my fingers and magically bring back the gold standard, we'd once again transition to a fiat system in no time. And why don't we like centralization again? Well, centralization requires trust. It requires you to trust whatever central power it is. In the case of money, when we centralize the power, it comes in the form of a central bank and, to an extent, the government as well. So it requires that we trust the politicians and the central bankers to always act in the best interest of society and to spend money responsibly. You have to trust them not to borrow against our future and spend frivolously now. And I don't care what country you're from, whether you're from a dictatorship or a democracy. If I told you that you have to trust your country's politicians and central bankers to act in the best interest of the common citizen and to not overspend and throw away ours and our kids' futures, would you trust them? Do you even know all the names of the people in your country who are running the central bank? Or the names of the politicians that have jobs related to the economy? I think most of you probably answered no to all of those questions. Keep in mind as well that the people who run the central banks in most countries are not even elected officials, even if you're from a democratic country. If you disagree with the actions of your central bank, in most if not all countries, you can't even vote them out of office. So my point is that when you introduce centralization, you introduce this element of human greed to the situation. When you concentrate power into the hands of very small groups of people, this really exacerbates the flaws of human nature. When you have a decentralized system, yes, there is still greed, but that power is not concentrated enough, so an individual's influence over the system is rather limited. The issue with gold is that since it's just a physical object, it doesn't bring with it a protocol or any way to manage this decentralized system. So once again, with gold, the power inevitably gets centralized. If only there was something that had similar properties to gold, but was more portable and was more divisible, and came with its own set of rules, i.e. a protocol, that allowed this form of money to stay decentralized but still have a way to manage its own system. Can you think of anything? It's a shame. I'm stumped. To wrap up today's episode, I'd like to share one more small fun tidbit with you. In February of 2021, a famous Bitcoin critic and gold advocate, Peter Schiff, in response to a tweet from Elon Musk, Schiff had this to say about aliens using gold. Schiff said, "If Earth has a future currency, it will be backed by real money, gold. If there's intelligent life on other planets and we want to trade with them, they'll almost certainly accept payment in gold. They'll refuse to accept payment in Bitcoin or any other paper or cryptocurrency." Now, this tweet is hilarious for several reasons. The first one being that it invokes the old man yells at cloud meme from The Simpsons. Except in Schiff's case, it's an old man yelling at Bitcoin. But seriously though, let's evaluate this claim seriously, and if an alien civilization came to Earth and wanted to trade with us, would they be using gold as money? I think Mr. Schiff has forgotten an important lesson that you learn in high school chemistry. He forgot that gold is an element on the periodic table, meaning that he forgot gold is an element that occurs naturally, which means that yes, although there is gold on Earth, there's also plenty of it out in space. In 2019, an article was published in Fox News detailing NASA's plans to send a probe to an asteroid in the asteroid belt that lies in between the orbits of Mars and Jupiter. One particular asteroid, named 16 Psyche, is estimated to contain a slew of precious metals such as gold and platinum. In 2019 prices, the sum of the value of the precious metals contained in 16 Psyche is estimated to be about 10 quintillion US dollars. This is simply one asteroid among millions of asteroids just in the asteroid belt alone, just in our solar system. Considering that there are billions of other planets in just our galaxy and trillions of asteroids, the amount of gold in space in human terms is essentially infinite. The issue is simply getting to it. Although, if an alien civilization was advanced enough for interstellar communication or interstellar travel even, paying them with gold for their goods would be just an absolutely laughable concept. It'd be like an ant trying to trade a rock with us for an iPhone. Since if they're advanced enough to travel through space, asteroid mining would be to them as easy as a trip down to the grocery store for us. In fact, even if we don't encounter any aliens, it's entirely conceivable that within the next 100 years or so, human technology would be sufficient to mine asteroids ourselves. When aluminum was first discovered in the 19th century, its value by weight was approximately twice of that as gold. Now we use it as disposable wrapping paper to wrap baked potatoes. Could you imagine the impact on the price of gold on Earth if technology became sufficiently advanced to mine just one asteroid like the one that NASA discovered? I don't know about you, but I'm ready to wrap my baked potatoes in gold foil. There ain't no bitcoins in space. That's all I'm saying. Anyways, all this talk of baked potatoes making me hungry, and I think it's a great time to end this show this week. Next week, we're continuing with our analogies of space travel, and we'll talk about the Bitcoin black hole. Find out what that's about next episode. For now, thank you all for listening. Bye-bye.